Hello and welcome. It's pretty crazy in the world right now. It especially feels crazy after this last election cycle. And in honor of Inauguration Day, I would like to share my I Love Me binder, which outlines my Navy experience from March of 2018 to March of 2023. And the experience I had as a trans person in the Navy. Now, I was not trans when I joined the Navy, but along the path of being in the journey, I developed an independence from my family and no longer felt the social pressures that caused me to remain closeted for the majority of my life. So there was a point where I finally had felt comfortable coming out. And interestingly, it aligns relatively well with the election of Joe Biden in the last presidential cycle. But before we get to that, let's start at the beginning. So without further ado, the first document I have in my I Love Me binder is a certificate from the Substance Abuse Rehabilitation Program. What this is a program for people suffering from alcoholism or people who have an incident with alcohol. And mine was on the basis of a self-referral. What had happened is a person had called me an alcoholic, and I told him if he called me an alcoholic again, I would kick his ass. So my command gave me the opportunity to self-refer to the Substance Abuse Rehabilitation Program. I went through a course there, and it set me back 1 week in my education. So when we get to this next document, which is my graduation from A school, I actually wasn't in the class that I had initially started in. But I felt an immense guilt for taking the Distinguished Military Graduate Award from the person who ultimately got second place in the class next to me. So I wound up giving the challenge coin for that to him because, again, I don't necessarily think I should have been rewarded with that. Following my graduation from A school, I was moved to Fort Gordon, Georgia to study strategic SHF. And in Fort Gordon, I was appointed to third class because I was an electronics technician. Really enjoyed my education there. It was a long course. So at the end of the education for strategic SHF, we actually got a evaluation from the schoolhouse. And because our evaluation was as the one of one person departing on that day, most of us were able to get EPs as third classes to take for our second class exam, which benefited us greatly. A lot of us picked up on the first cycle. So after that, we are in about, I want to say December of 2019, I ship out to the Kingdom of Bahrain. One of the first things I did when I got out to Bahrain was I signed up for a collateral duty so I could meet more people. I felt like the MWR, or Morale, Welfare, Recreation Organization, would be a good fit for me because who doesn't like recreation? I was ultimately elected as the secretary, and I had a blast doing the events that we got to do. But something happened in March of that year, March of 2020 that is, that put the world on halt. Even though the global pandemic happened, we were still able to take the advancement exam in our normal cycle. And so I actually was able to pick up second class off of my first exam, but it was delayed a little bit for my certificate of appointment due to the delays caused by a global pandemic, COVID. But at this point, I was a second class in Bahrain, having a good time working on some systems that were really interesting to me. And at this point, the MWR committee started to pick up again because restrictions had sort of lifted towards the end of 2020, and we were in a period where we could finally do an election cycle for the next MWR cabinet because they're 6-month positions, but this one had drug on a little bit long. So I ran as the vice president, and it was interesting because the person who I took vice president from the previous cabinet at the committee meeting made a big deal of saying, you know, Chloe, you really got to step up your game if you're going to be vice president this time around. You really slacked last time. And I go, well, what about the pandemic? And he goes, you could have reached out. So that's what the military culture is like. There are people that just are special. But soon after this appointment, I was appointed to the work center soup of my respective equipment. I received an eval that didn't necessarily reflect that, and I was a little upset about it. But then we get into about the time where I learned that the Navy had just passed legislation where trans people were allowed to serve openly because of the recent election. Now, I do want to say January 6th was an absolute abomination, truly disgusting. Ew. But in June of that year, I was put up for a Sailor of the Quarter board, and one of the questions asked what my opinion on trans sailor serving is, and I had no knowledge of the instruction, so I was actually pretty grateful to have the instruction told to me so I could then give the opinion. Well, if someone's going through the process of transitioning, the likelihood that anyone should take issue with it only means that they're trying to govern someone else, which isn't necessarily what the Navy is about. The Navy is about being a well-functioning machine and working towards our mission objective. That is to say, I don't have an issue with trans people serving. And a few weeks after that Sailor of the Quarter board, I sort of reflected on myself and my own freedoms from the boundaries that I had set in my personal life prior to joining. And I actually came out as trans. So in August of that year, I had received my diagnosis. I was set for a duty relocation to Japan. But after I had come out as trans, I started receiving a little bit different of treatment from my peers, and the way in which people would talk to me became different, not because I was trans, but because they would repeatedly let me know that the only reason they were misgendering me is because that's what the rules said. And so I started challenging those rules and said, well, who's enforcing those rules here and now? And that helped me out a lot, but I had a lot of struggles in this time. And I ultimately had a meltdown on Christmas of 2021 that resulted in me changing my anxiety medication. And I had to stop drinking at that point and really just clean up my act. But through it all, I still chose to re-enlist. And even after such a close call, where I received no punishment for my actions on that Christmas, even though rightfully I could have received punishment, I still was able to receive an EP on my evaluation for that cycle. So that left me with a MP EP. And in the documentation from the big Navy rejecting me for my transition to Japan, they mentioned that I was to transfer limited duty to the United States. My therapist at the time complied with the directions of Big Navy and sent me limited duty to the United States, but I was held in Bahrain until June of 2022, which thankfully put me just past the 90-day cycle of an evaluation, so that instead of getting a letter of extension on my March evaluation, I received a second evaluation that sustained the number 10 EP in the command for my transfer evaluation. I received a medical board that directed me to limited duty, and then I went to the United States. When I arrived in the United States, I didn't directly receive care. No one necessarily knew where to point me to receive any treatment. So the first place I went was Navy Medical, and my Navy Medical provider sent me to the mental health clinic, which seemed like the right choice, but I felt as if there was a special team assigned to transgender care that I was supposed to get in contact with that would then create a template for me to get permission from my commanding officer to then receive the care that was declared medically necessary at the time of diagnosis. So I Googled and found the mental health clinic, and then I went into the resources, and then I went into the collateral duties, and I found a PowerPoint for the transgender care team for Portsmouth Medical Center, and I finally found their email and sent them an email. And in that email, I outlined how I had a really bad appointment with the mental health therapist where, after my incident in Bahrain, I was pressed heavily on my use of alcohol, and then told I have anger issues, and then told that my provider does not have the resources necessary to give me care, but he would look into it, and at my follow-up appointment in 2 months, out of a 6-month timer that we're already 1 month into, I would be able to have an answer as to whether or not my name would be put on the list to receive a template to get approval from my CEO to receive care that was medically necessary. Now, saying all that sounds like a lot. Could you imagine if someone who needed an inhaler or someone who was looking for insulin had to go through that process for their care? Sure would be wild if it were medically necessary for them to receive treatment. When I got in contact with the transgender care team, I was met with a care provider who made it very clear that it was a collateral duty to them and that they didn't necessarily meet every other week for the transgender care team. So the process extended beyond that 1 month that I had the bad appointment with the therapist to then a sort of dragging on of about 2 months before I had an even worse mental breakdown. And at that point, a friend of mine that I reached out to had recommended I go to an inpatient treatment facility. I went to the inpatient treatment facility and received the care I needed at that time. And then I was released, and that would have been in about September of 2022. Interestingly enough, the same day I had my mental break is the same day that my transgender care plan was finalized by the transgender care team. But I wasn't informed of it. And so that afternoon when I went into the weekend and relapsed, I was under the impression that I had just crossed the halfway mark of my limited duty and not had a care plan in place or ready to even submit to my commanding officer. Now, when you submit a transgender care plan to a commanding officer, the commanding officer has 90 days. What it means for me to be beyond halfway means that I don't have 90 days until my limb due expires, which means if the CEO were to wait, that I would be subject to a limb due expiration and administrative discharge for a lack of improvement in a condition that I didn't receive treatment for, independent of whether or not the care plan was approved. You'll never guess what happened. Now, the middle of September was a pretty trying time for me, but believe it or not, a week before my incident, I took the first class petty officer exam, and I was going in with an eval average of MP, EP, EP. So I was pretty good, and then the results came back, 69. Got him. When you add up the numbers, I made it past the final multiple and actually was being appointed to first class petty officer the same month that my limb due was expiring, and after not hearing anything from the legal team at my command. But in December of that month, they reached out to me and let me know that they were wondering what they should do because my limb due had expired, and they didn't necessarily want to commit my next command to providing me with the care because they had no idea whether or not my orders would be extended for the duty station I was at the time. I very politely let them know that Navy Medical had already, when I excitedly told them I made first class, told me to be realistic because I was still going to get processed out of the Navy. And the legal team told me they had no information about that. Christmas of 2022 was pretty fun. I went out with some people from the command. An incredible person did my makeup for me, and I felt like I was on top of the world for that weekend. After New Year's, I got back and I received the information that the legal team had heard that I was being recommended for an administrative discharge from Navy Medical. And the legal team informed me that they were willing to go to bat for me. They were willing to fight for me. And my heart was broken because they could have gone to bat for me and they could have fought for me if they had taken my care plan down the hall to the CO and gotten a signature. So then my discharge was put up to the admiral and I was separated from the Navy. And a lot of people asked me, did you get an honorable discharge? And when I get that question, it makes me laugh because I think I have a different definition of honorable than the Navy does. I'm doing well now. I'm in a much better position. I have a great support group around me. My family loves me. Everything is good. it's just seeing the politics of America now, having been in Bahrain and experienced a world where the authority figures in my life would tell me, these people want to kill you, these people want to throw you off a building. And then I came back to the US at the same time Kid Rock is shooting Bud Light cans because Dylan Mulvaney was trans and received one promo can. And I have to believe that these people I fight for, these rights that I defend, don't extend to myself because the people I'm fighting for don't believe I'm a person. I am incredibly grateful for how far I've gotten in life, and I look forward to the mountains I will climb in the future. I hope that the next 4 years aren't with similar rhetoric as the past 8 years, because even though I'm a trans veteran, I don't feel as if this country is made up of people who represent my interests anymore, which is a very isolating feeling, having given myself for my country. So I just wanted to share my story because it's Inauguration Day and we're getting another 4 years of President Trump, and Peter Hegseth somehow is being appointed to the Department of Defense. And in my career, when I was discharged from the Navy, they didn't say it was because I was trans. It was because I was anxious and because I had received a counseling in 2018 November for substance abuse rehabilitation, because I told the guy I'd kick his ass if he called me an alcoholic one more time. And even still, because of where I work, I'm not entirely unaffected by the election of a trans senator and then them banning trans people from using their preferred bathrooms in federal facilities. But at the same time, I wonder, how are they planning to enforce it? Anyway, thank you for joining me. I just felt as if I had to share because I think I'm probably one person. But when I got removed from the Navy, it didn't end there. During my time in, I went to a conference at which the MCPON attended, and I spoke with him towards the tail end of my time in. And so after I was discharged, I felt compelled to send an email to the MCPON outlining exactly how the rhetoric used in the instruction for the interim care of transgender people from the nav admin that allowed trans people to serve openly, which was in extension for over a year, even though it was supposed to be updated annually. But I outlined to him in an email exactly how that instruction allows people to be misgendered and how that is in contrast to the Navy's zero tolerance policy on bullying. And I can't say for certain that my email changed the instruction, but 3 months later, a new instruction came out for the Navy that allowed the informal use of preferred pronouns for service members. And in my heart, I like to think that I made a difference. So if you stuck around, thank you so much for listening. I hopefully will never have to tell this story again. I want to burn this I love me binder and never think about the fact that I served. But I am a trans veteran, as ashamed as I am of my country, and I love you all. Thank you for watching. Have a good one. Bye.